Hi there, my name is Ian Berry and welcome to another candid and convivial conversation. I'm thrilled today that my special guest is Andrew Thorp. He's a great friend from the UK, and I don't know anyone better in the world today who's able to help people to craft better stories about ourselves and about our business. So Andrew, welcome.
Hi Ian, it's great to be with you.
And I did see Andrew take his jumper off a moment ago, so the sun is obviously shining in the UK, Andrew.
No, I put the heating on to dry some towels, if the truth be told, Ian.
Okay, fair enough. I've been, as you know, Andrew, I've been doing a lot of work recently around people. The idea that we're sharing stories, perhaps more than telling them. I think we are telling them, but more and more storytelling, as you know, has become one of the buzzwords, one of the most popular topics around today. And I'm fascinated with your idea of crafting better stories about ourselves and the whole idea of sharing them in everyday context. So I guess my first question for you today, where do we begin to craft a better story about ourselves and our business?
Well, I'll tell you where it started, because the best way of answering that question is to talk about where my interest in it began, I think. And that is that I had a personal reinvention in my life about, must be maybe 8 years ago now, a turning point. And I think many people do have a turning point, and often self-employed people have come from employment because something happened to them or they reached a turning point in their lives.
Yes.
So I had a reinvention from years and years in the sports industry. And I had a bit of a midlife crisis, you know, a number of things kind of went south, as they say. And I had an opportunity to reinvent myself and become a speaker and a writer and a trainer. So I guess in a way, I had an interesting element of my own story to tell, because clearly people were asking me, you know, well, what are you doing now? Why have you changed direction? So, you know, I started telling them that story.
Yes.
And it kind of struck me that people were very interested because it sounded very different from the normal thing you get in networking circles, where people say, well, what do you do? Oh, I'm an accountant, or I'm a web designer, and blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
Which is very samey. You know, there's nothing to distinguish that answer from anybody else who does the same kind of work.
No.
But I suppose my response sounded much more personal and more human and more transparent and open, I guess. And I noticed that people were responding really well to this, and they were fascinated. So rather than this, you know, we talk about B2C and B2B. Well, this was more H2H. You know, this was human to human. This connection that was being made.
Yes, yes.
So I suppose that was one of the reasons why I began taking an interest in storytelling and crafting your own story. And obviously for me, I had quite an interesting or unusual turning point in my life. And other people may say, well, I don't have nothing interesting ever happens to me. You know, I lead a boring life. I just go to work and come home. But again, even for those people, I think that they can find things in their everyday experiences, much like stand-up comedians do. You know, observational humor is very much about seeing the small things and then finding an interest or an angle in those things. So, you know, it doesn't need to be something traumatic or dramatic in one's own story, but I think you need to have some material there to hand, which can create an interesting conversation, perhaps in a business environment.
I like the words there, everyday and human to human. I think I was very blessed in my own speaking career many years ago when one of my mentors, David Griggs, he explained to me one day that it's not the story that we tell or share, it's how other people feel themselves in the story. And so
I like that. And it also, I can't remember who said this, but they said that the power of the story is not that it's brand new to people, it's that it's strangely familiar.
Yes.
In other words, they can see themselves in what you're talking about. And I think therein lies the power of the connection that's made.
Yes.
You know, people relate to it. It reminds them of something perhaps they've forgotten that they have always known. That's maybe buried there, or gets them to see things in a different way, but the connection is made.
Yes, and I think therefore the human to human piece. I mean, I like you. I think all this B2B, B2C is all rubbish. It's never going to be anything more than human to human, and yet in that ordinariness is the power. In that simplicity is the profound, and that's also the power of stories.
Exactly. But let me just mention one thing though that happened the other. Here's a story. Something that happened the other day in a training session.
Yeah.
I run training sessions at the moment for a number of companies, and typically what we'll do is we'll share stories in the first half of a 2-hour session, and then we will do what I call a skill share session. So that means that rather than me teaching people things about listening skills or storytelling or emotional intelligence or leadership, I actually get them to volunteer to research one of those topics and then present it to their peers. So there's this sense of ownership, because I think the fastest way to learn something is to teach it. So in this particular session, one of the guys shared a story in the first half, and he said that he'd been to his first ever networking event, because he's relatively young, he's about 25, 26. And he said he felt really out of place. He didn't know what to say. He was very nervous. He was conscious that he knew less than anybody else in the room about the industry that he was in.
Yes.
So there was clearly a confidence problem for him. And then later on in the session, he gave a presentation. He was one of the 2 people to volunteer to do a soft skills topic. And his topic was confidence.
Right.
But did he say anything about his own experience? No. He didn't mention that he personally had an experience where confidence was an issue. And the reason he didn't mention it wasn't because he'd already spoken about it in a different part of the session. It was because I think people tend to default to an abstract treatment of a topic like confidence or leadership. You know, they'll look it up on Wikipedia if they're not used to presenting and say, well, here's the definition and these are the things that you need to think about, but they don't weave themselves into the topic.
Incredible, isn't it? But
so in other words, he had a personal experience that would have led beautifully into the topic and made it more personal and more, you know, he would have demonstrated a connection with that topic. And then I think the audience would have been much more likely to then weave themselves into it. So I had a similar thing the other week.
Because we all do, and I was with a client this morning, and then a prospective client who became a client this afternoon, and the common thread between those two was the story, the ordinary story, and yet. And often the simplicity of the story, but in there the profoundness. And I always find that that's the great juxtaposition, I guess you'd call it. Where it's something.
I think that people don't do this. You know, if, for example, they're speaking to an audience, they don't put these personal experiences in, partly because they don't see them in the first place. They haven't lodged them in their locker, so to speak, in their story locker. But also perhaps it's because they feel maybe that little things like that don't matter. Or perhaps, well, why would the audience be interested in anything that's happened to little old me? You know, it's too insignificant. I'm too, perhaps it's they feel that it's a bit egotistical maybe to put themselves into a story, and you know they wouldn't be interested in me. Or maybe there's a fear of disclosure of showing something personal.
Yes.
In a business context, they feel a little exposed or vulnerable, perhaps.
Yes.
But I mean, you and I and others know that that's what the audience loves to hear. They love to hear this personalised approach to a topic.
They do, and I remember recently I did a presentation for a client for the 3rd time, and I didn't tell a particular story, as we would call it a signature story. And I didn't tell the story because I thought they've already heard it twice and they don't want to hear it again. Now, it was a fatal error on my behalf because the client was actually annoyed with me for not telling it.
That's like the music band who prefer to play their new material, but everybody wants the old hits.
It's a bit like that, and as was pointed out to me, you know, there were 25% of the room who hadn't heard it at all, and as you know, even the same story told in a different context, in a different situation, has its own power. So how do you go about taking these ordinary everyday things? I mean, probably today, in my case, it's the end of the day, in your case, the beginning of the day, but I reckon there's probably already been, just in my encounter with half a dozen people, I've probably already come across 25 stories.
Yes. Yeah. I'm the same.
And this happens every day.
I know. I'm like the kid in that film, or what's that film? The Sixth Sense. The little kid who sees dead people.
Yes.
With the guy with Bruce Willis, you know.
Yeah.
And I don't see dead people. I see stories everywhere, and I see linkages between things. It's just the way my brain works. And I know I'm unusual. I know most people aren't quite like that. But I do think it's a skill you can develop and acquire to become a little bit more curious and see things that you didn't see before.
So how do we do that?
I think, first of all, you've got to see what it looks like. You know, people have to understand that an everyday experience can actually have some interesting angle to it.
Yes.
So if you show them examples of what that looks like, I think that's the first step in them being able to do it themselves.
Yes.
And let me give you a little example of this, if I may. I've been coaching a young man recently called Hassan, and he's 26 years of age. He's a lovely guy. He works in the financial services industry.
Yeah.
And I was introduced to him by his boss with a view to helping him. And I assumed it was about presenting skills, because that's a lot of what I'm known for, is helping people with that. And although he does present as part of his work, that wasn't the issue. The problem for him was the small talk either side of a pitch that he has to give.
No.
It's the cocktail reception or the networking or the dinner afterwards when he sits with people. He doesn't know what to say. He's got no conversation, no small talk. So we sat down for our first session, and I said, well, look, Hassan, has anything unusual or interesting been happening in your life recently? And he looked blankly at me, as if to say no. But I wouldn't take no for an answer. So eventually we got to the point where he said something quite interesting. He said, well, I've been looking after my niece. And I said, well, how old is she? And he said, well, she's 1.5. So I'm thinking, well, there must be some potential here. A 26-year-old lad and a 1.5-year-old little girl. There's the potential there, isn't there, for a mismatch or lessons learned. But again, he couldn't see that there was anything potentially interesting in that, an everyday experience. But, you know, I wouldn't take no for an answer. So we dug a little bit, and then he revealed the nugget. He told me that he's a very fast eater. You know, he shovels food in his mouth like there's no tomorrow. And, you know, when he's feeding his niece, if her mum's left, the niece with him to look after, then he has to feed her. And at meal times, she's got her bowl of food, he's got his plate of food, and he's finished in 1.5 minutes. And she's still got a bowl full of food. But then she stops because she refuses to eat if he's not eating. So the only way that he could get her to finish her meal so her mum wouldn't come home and tell him off for not feeding the niece is to slow down his eating. So they match their timings. So I looked at Hassan and I said, do you mean to tell me, Hassan, that you've been taught how to eat properly by a 1-year-old? And he said, well, I suppose I have, haven't I? So he liked that story, and I like that story, and I've told it many times now, and it always makes people laugh. And interestingly, he's begun to find other things that are interesting about supposedly everyday experiences through this one example. But there is a little bit of an after story for this as well, which I only gleaned the other day. He said that he's been telling this story in the office, and there was a girl in the office who's never said a word to anybody. She's really quiet, painfully quiet and introverted. And he said that when she heard this story going around the office, she started opening up a little bit about looking after her nephew. And no one had heard her speak before. So that was really nice. And then, and the final bit of the story is that they're now going out together.
There you go. Well,
so it's a matchmaking agency here as well. It's not just helping people with storytelling. But to answer your question, I hope that does answer your question in a way through an example. I think if you show people examples of what ordinary things turned into interesting stories looks like, they are more likely to know what to look for then.
I think it's also, it's also your skill in how you help to, because you delved deeper, then you delved deeper again. So yeah. What kind of questions were you asking?
I think I just waited really for him to think about, well, anything that is happening, and the thing with his niece came up into his head. But again, at the start, he didn't think that was interesting. So I just asked him, well, what was it like? You know, was it an unusual experience? How did you react to it? Did anything change, you know, for you in the process of looking after it? Did you learn anything? And then the thing about eating quickly came to his head.
Yes.
So I think you've just got to ask the right kind of prodding and probing questions, and then people get to it.
And obviously, did you encourage him to share this story in the corridors, as it were, or did that come about from his newfound confidence, or was it a bit of both?
He did it. I didn't tell him to share. I asked him permission for me to share it, and he said he's fine with that. And then he only told me later that he'd been telling this story around the office, and then this thing about the girl in the office that he's now going out with.
Yeah. and how often, I'm sure this has been the case. It's certainly been the case for me that one story became another story that became another story that became another.
It compounds. It's like that. Have you come across that principle in improvisation, in improv, called yes and?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So rather than yes but, it's yes and. So in other words, you're always compounding and adding on. And I think it's a little bit like that with stories, because when one person hears a story, they kind of connect with it and add a little bit to it. So I think stories are almost alive in a way, rather like wine. You know, they evolve and mature because people add their own experiences to them.
Yeah, I'm sure that's why stories spread. That's why stories become memorable. As you were talking earlier, I was thinking about something I heard, which I can't. You might know exactly what it is, but something about a picture paints 1,000 words, but the right words paint one picture, or something, you know, to that. And when we hear someone share an authentic story, regardless of how ordinary they might have seen it in the first place, when we hear them share that story and we feel ourselves in the story, everyone is elevated.
Yeah.
And that's where the learning and the lessons are.
Mm. But I remember when I started doing a story sharing regularly within one particular company I'm working with now, they're in the construction industry. There was a lady who was very, very nervous about speaking in front of her peers. You know, it was like public speaking, even though there were only 12 people in the room and they're all her colleagues.
Yes.
Nonetheless, it was an intimidating experience for her. And she had a story, and she struggled her way through, but she had to leave the room halfway through to collect herself. You know, she was really nervous about doing this. And I know in the next few months, her boss kind of whispered to me that, well, maybe we should let her off and not force her to share anything in the next one. But do you know what? After about 4 or 5 months, she would put her hand up at the end and say, actually, I've got something I'd like to share. And she now is a really good, confident participant in this process, which is very heartening, you know, to see someone grow like that, when at the start she didn't feel that she really had anything to say that would be interesting to anybody. Because very often people say when they bring a story with them, I don't know whether this is the kind of thing you're looking for, or I don't know whether this is good enough, but you know,
yeah, this is
opinion of.
Yes, this is a deeper process. I think that it's been long said that stories are the fabric of culture. And I'm a firm believer in that. I think at a deeper level, organisations that are successful, I'm in no doubt about this after playing in organisations for the 25 years along these lines, that when people feel valued, their performance is better. And the reason why people don't share stories, yes, it is because they don't think they might be interesting to someone else, or they don't see the deeper part of the deeper meaning, the deeper essence of the story. But I think most people don't share their stories because they don't feel valued by others. And yet when they start to feel valued, and so my sense is with this lady that over a period of time she began to feel valued because she was in an environment that made that possible.
Yes.
And then when she felt valued, she began to share her story. And I've seen this over and over and over. And stories are one of the key links. I know in a meeting that I was participating in today, one of the guys has been reluctant to share his point of view, even though it is a profound insight for everyone else in the room. But the reason he's been reluctant is because he didn't feel like anyone else would value his opinion.
Yeah, but that's a symptom or an indicator of something else, isn't it?
Indeed.
He's not, generally speaking, doesn't feel valued within the organisation.
Yeah, so stories and story sharing are a great way to help people to feel valued and to create environments where they can share some of themselves, and all of a sudden they're out in the corridors sharing it.
Exactly.
Which encourages everyone else to do the same thing. And then
it's quite a levelling experience as well, because I think everybody's individual story is valued. Everybody has the platform to share something.
Yes.
But I come back again to this point that people do sometimes struggle to find the stories to accumulate the material. I remember one guy told a really nice story. I think it was about the fact that he'd never really got any feedback from his boss. His boss never really said anything about whether he was doing a good job or not. And then when he did, he really valued it.
That's right.
It meant a lot to him because it was just so unusual. Yes. When it happened, it was really valuable. So I think in some cases that's interesting, because I think when you're fulsome with praise all the time about everything, it can sometimes undervalue the time when you do give praise, because it's almost so normal that people don't notice it anymore. So maybe there is a value in praising things that really do require praise, but rather than cheapening it.
Well, I think there are. Often my work is around. I think there are levels of appreciation. It's like William James, the eminent psychologist. He said the deepest human desire is to feel appreciated, and I fully get that. But I think there are levels of appreciation. It's like. At a very basic level, but again at a profound level, saying please and thank you is a form of appreciation.
I know, it's almost like there's a scale of 1 to 10, isn't there? And if you're always at 10, then I think it's not as good. There's occasionally giving a 1 and a 3 and a 5 and sometimes a 9 or a 10.
No, exactly right. Yeah, and there is that kind of a ladder. And if you're varying, where you're at with that, appreciation doesn't become mundane. There's always something unique and special about it.
Exactly.
And that in itself.
Anyway, I was saying about this guy.
Yes.
Who told this story in the first one we ever did.
Yes.
And then he said to me afterwards, he said, "What am I going to do at the second one? Because I've used my story now."
Yes, that's right.
He only had one. And I said, "Well, surely you've got more than one." He said, "Oh, I can't think of another one." But of course, I don't know what you're like. Well, I do know what you're like, and I'm sure you're like this. But I'll ring my business partner Sarah up at the end of the day or the end of the week or whatever, and we'll run through all the things that have happened and what we've seen and what we've noticed. And there's loads of stuff every day, every week, loads of stuff.
Well,
and,
I was just going to say, I started. I've kept a journal for a very long time, but I started about 15 years ago, an idea I got from a colleague of mine about actually keeping a story journal. And it was mainly for, for my presentations. And I began creating shorter and longer versions of different stories. But in that journal now, I've got over 300 stories. And most of those came out of everyday situations. And I know myself, I'm in the habit of writing every day. Most of my writing doesn't see the light of day, but, it ends up in, I post blogs 4 times a week, but I write every day. And most of that writing is triggered by a story that came from yesterday.
Yes.
Now, as I say, sometimes often it doesn't go anywhere, but the discipline of writing it down, and maybe that's a way that people can search their well, because everyone's got a deep well of stories.
Yes.
And we don't know how deep the well is until we go looking.
Yeah.
And a journal is one way.
Yeah, but I think stuff happens to us all the time.
Yeah.
I'll just mention. I think I told you about the coffee incident I had the other day, didn't I? I don't know. May I just share this with your?
You did, but I think it's a great insight. Yes,
it's quite a nice story. So I'm sat in the boardroom of this company that I'm pitching to. This is our second meeting, and there's me and 2 others. And I'd arrived early. This is in Manchester in the UK. So I'd arrived early, and I'd had a coffee. We have a coffee chain called Cafe Nero in the UK.
Yes.
So I popped into Nero just nearby for a coffee before the meeting, and then I'm led into the boardroom, and they said, "Would you like a coffee?" And I thought, well, and then she said, "Well, we're just going to nip to Cafe Nero to get a posh one." So I said, "Well, all right, then I'll have another one, but I'll have a decaf because I've just had one recently." So they brought 3 takeaway coffee cups into the meeting.
Yeah.
2 ordinary ones and another one with a stamp on to show that it's a decaf. And the meeting's going really, really well. And I noticed during the meeting that they were making very good eye contact with me. which is always a good sign, isn't it? That you're getting through and you're making a connection. And things were going really, really well. And I left the meeting having been asked to put a proposal together, which is always a good sign. Feeling very good, very elated. And I'm driving home and I look in the rearview mirror and I'm horrified to see that I've had a nosebleed.
Yeah, I've done it.
Because there's a mark on the end of my nose. I'm thinking, oh my God, I've had a nosebleed. I didn't realise. When did that happen? And I thought, well, it's not the right colour. It's a bit pink.
Yes.
And what had happened is that they stamped decaf onto the top of the takeaway cup. And as I was drinking out of it, the stamp transferred the ink to the end of my nose, and they never said a word in the whole meeting. And I realised that, well, no wonder they were looking at me, because that's what they were looking at. So anyway, we had a big laugh about it on the Monday afterwards. I said, did I look a bit strange in that meeting? And they said, yeah, well, we didn't want to say anything in case it was like a boil on the end of your nose, and we didn't want to embarrass you.
But it's a great story, but you've also highlighted one of the great truths about stories, and that is self-depreciating humour.
Yes.
Because,
exactly.
So many speakers I've seen, they say, I can't tell jokes. Well, the good news is you don't have to. You've just got to tell stories like you just.
Exactly. It's not a joke. It's just a story that's got a humorous element to it, which takes the Mickey out of me.
That's it.
And that's fine. And I think it actually enhanced the relationship that I had with them, and they've hired me since, and we get on really, really well. And we talk about the red nose incident from time to time. But stuff happens all the time.
Every single day there's something, and when we share it, of course, it encourages other people to share too.
Exactly. But I mean, you see, you've seen an angle in that story about, self-deprecation and people who speak to an audience and use humor, usually direct the humor at themselves, because it's obviously not a very good idea to take the mickey out of the audience.
No.
So I think there's a nice angle and a learning there, isn't there?
Yes, indeed.
And similarly, it isn't just that things have to happen personally to you. It could be that you watch something on TV or you see something on the internet that piques your interest. And so in a way, when people bring stories to these story shares, sometimes it might be, well, I looked at this thing on the internet the other day and I thought that was really weird, or it got me thinking. So the story is simply that they observe something, but it's not enough just to say that you observe something. I want to know, well, what did it mean to you?
Yes.
And has it led to any subsequent action or changed the way you think about something?
Yes, and I think that's also, that kind of sharing is also refreshing, because it's in direct contrast to the spin that we hear from politicians every day of the week. There's a big laugh going on in Australia at the moment because the government's under a lot of pressure, and they're coming out, all trying to be on message and, all this kind of stuff. And obviously some script writers, some spin doctors have written a whole lot of one-liners. And the politicians have been out trotting out these one-liners, and then someone leaked the actual script. So all the one-liners are out in the public domain.
They're out now. I can't use those anymore.
And yet, but even then, it was interesting. I watched television, only very briefly last evening, but what really made me laugh was that even though the script written by the spin doctors had been leaked, here the politicians were later on still trotting out the lines.
Yeah, because it's become a habit. It's a default for them.
Yeah.
You see, every morning I go on the BBC's website and I just scan around to see what's happening. And very often something I'll read or see that leads to a thought, that maybe leads to a blog or some further research.
Yes.
And at the moment in the UK, I don't know whether you're aware of this or not, but the Labour Party is in a little bit of disarray.
They can't find a leader.
Yeah,
indeed.
And they've got this guy, Jeremy Corbyn, who's quite left-wing in his views and quite radical. And he's in polls, he's coming out on top.
He's also elderly, isn't he?
Yeah, he's quite an old. He's got a grey beard, and everybody's warning that, oh my God, if this guy gets in, we'll never win an election. So it's quite an interesting time. And Gordon Brown, the ex-prime minister, was wheeled out the other day, and he was giving the warning against this move to the left. And he gave a speech for about maybe 3.5 minutes, which was broadcast through the BBC. And do you know what, Ian? In 3.5 minutes, he walked 1.3 miles, pacing up and down like a caged tiger, never looking at the audience, in that kind of pontificating schoolmastery kind of way. And it was awful, because you were so distracted with the movement, like a tennis match where the ball's going this way and that. And he really didn't connect with the audience at all. And the movement was, as I said, distracted you from the message.
It's a shame. I saw him give us a speech that I think was on TED somewhere, that's about, his love of what we need to do for children.
Yes.
And
yes.
it was one of the most engaging, inspiring stories I've ever watched. And I thought to myself, why didn't he tell stories like that when he was Prime Minister?
Yes, yeah. I think he comes across as a really, really nice guy. I think he's a very genuine guy.
Yes.
But was never blessed with great charisma or great public speaking skills.
No.
And yet, it was just interesting that on this occasion he paced up and down. But do you remember you and I having a conversation a few years ago? Because I've spoken at TEDx a couple of times.
Yes.
And the first time I spoke, it was at Warwick University in about 2009 to about 400 people. And I was really nervous, and I hadn't done a lot of public speaking by then, you know, at that level. And I paced up and down like a tiger. And I watched it afterwards, and I thought, for God's sake, Thorpe, just stand still, would you? Mm. So I think even things like watching a clip on the TV can spark a thought, and you can weave yourself into it, as I do now with that TEDx talk.
Yes.
About how, you know, I used to do that. It's very easy to get into that pacing habit.
Yeah, it's a real
quite distracting.
It's a real discipline. I know in my early years, again, David Griggs, what he taught me to do was to move deliberately without speaking, which taught me how to pause, but it also taught me how to be still at certain moments. Because that's part of the craft, whether we are speaking to an audience of 400 people, as you say, or 4. It's still the pace, the pause, how we use our physiology. There's a whole lot of so we've kind of gone the spectrum here. It's about noticing everyday stories about feeding your niece, but then there's also the crafting aspect, where over time I think we learned that we've each got, you know, that famous line, there are 1,000 stories in the naked city. We've all got 1,000 stories, and then over time, once we feel valued and we're able to express them, we can then begin to add these crafting pieces like stillness, the pause, our physiology, the voice, and so on.
But I think it's the trick is, I mean, I remember reading Tony Robbins talking about the reticular activating system in the brain.
Yes.
Which he described as the brain's filtering mechanism. So it determines what we notice and what we don't.
I think originally a Lou Tice idea from memory, the reticular activating system. But anyway.
So my interpretation of it is if you buy a new car of a particular make and model, sometimes you see them everywhere.
Yes.
Or if your wife or your girlfriend's pregnant, you see pregnant women everywhere. It's, you know, so the same number of those things was out there before, but you have a new reason to notice them, and you do.
Yes.
So I think the trick with this story stuff of filling your library is just simply to be interested in certain things, and then those will come out of the woodwork, and you'll see them everywhere then.
I think that's exactly right, and my feeling is that the first step of that is just simply to be interested in people. You know, it's it never ceases to amaze me. When I was researching the Changing What's Normal book, I discovered that 100 billion people thereabouts, give or take a million or few, but somewhere between 80 and 100 billion people have walked planet Earth, and there's never been a duplicate. So just by nature of our birth, we are remarkable. And yet most people are not claiming they're remarkable. And my sense is that the kind of work you're doing in smaller groups, encouraging people to feel valued and able to share their story, I think it's one of the great doorways to people reclaiming their remarkability in my view. I think so.
It's kind of you to say, I think so. But you know, the other thing that strikes me about this is that people often fear when, for example, they're presenting to an audience, they fear that they'll get caught out, that they won't know something that somebody that asked them. You know, they'll be found out to be a fraud, or people in the audience know more than I do. And my response to that is, well, why don't you talk about something that you know more about than anybody else in the world? And that's you and the experiences that you've had, because you're the world authority on that.
Yes.
So in other words, if you can weave your own experiences into the theme that you're talking about, then no one in the audience can argue with you, because you know that better than anybody.
And what a way to build confidence and a greater sense of self-worth.
Exactly.
Yes. And so we're kind of getting towards the end of our time, and Andrew, you've probably got a whole bunch of great tips to add to what you've already shared. But perhaps some practical advice on when it comes to actually crafting the story, because I'm sure our viewers would value some ideas about how you go about that. So once you've seen something, how do you then craft it into the actual story?
Well, let's talk about structure first of all of a story.
Yeah.
I think a couple of tips here. The one that I read about a while ago, which is really nice, is there's a lady called Emma Coates who used to be a story artist for Pixar.
Oh yeah,
now Pixar Disney.
Yes.
And she came up with this theory that all of Pixar's movies have the same narrative structure. And it starts once upon a time, and then one day. Once upon a time, every day, then one day, and because of that, until finally. So you've got this sort of hero's journey type structure where, the status quo is fine, and then all of a sudden something happens which interrupts the flow, and then there are certain consequences of that, and the hero's trying to get things back on an even keel again, and then obviously there's some kind of resolution at the end.
Yes.
So I think it's really interesting that she's identified a common structure to what is really one of the great storytelling engines in the storytelling industry, which is Pixar and Disney.
Yes.
So I think, first of all, we can learn from the movies because they do storytelling really well.
Yes.
And secondly, she's identified some kind of structure, which I think does relate to this, hero's journey kind of thing.
It does.
Where we're particularly interested in a schism or an interruption to the normal flow of things, and then how people respond to that.
Yes, well, Joseph Campbell, who you've no doubt read, who created this idea of the hero's journey, he called it the monomyth. It's the one story that, is within us all. Nancy Duart has a lovely way of saying this in probably shorter terms. She said that, it's that continual journey from what is to what can be.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I like that. So I think that's quite an inspiring example.
Yes.
And obviously you have to tweak it a little bit, but I think the principle of, explain how things were normally, and then what happened, or why has it become problematic, and therefore what can we do about it, and how's that gone, and what's the resolution been, and what have the learnings been of the whole process. I think it's a useful structure to walk yourself through. Yeah,
which is exactly what your friend with his 1-year-old niece did.
Yes, exactly. And the second structural thing is, I think you and I have spoken about this before. I've come up with this concept of a 3-layered cake for the story, let's say, of a business.
Yes,
yes. And the 3 layers are: the top layer is your big picture. This is your philosophy as a business, your more conceptual purpose and your why and your values. These are more conceptual things.
Yes.
But, they're kind of the glue that holds everything together, and the compass heading for the business.
Yeah.
And then the middle layer is the machinery. That's the basic nuts and bolts of what you offer and how much it costs, and your delivery method and so forth. But that's kind of the boring stuff.
Yes.
In a storytelling sense. But that tends to be the thing that people get a bit lost on or focus on too much, because they're very familiar with that when they're describing the business. But it's like an empty framework. It's a bit dull and cold on its own. And then your lower layer is the library, which is where all these little stories come in and little examples. And I think the great communicators weave between those 3 layers. There's elements of each in there to differing proportions depending on the circumstances and what's required. But I think people are often very weak on the why and the purpose and the philosophy. And they're often very weak as well on the library, because they can't think of any examples, or they don't know how to weave them into a wider message. And they tend to just default to the machinery layer and come across as boring and not different from any of their rivals.
Yeah, no, which is where we began when people at networking paying, and the question is, what do you do? And the people answer, and I'm an accountant, which is the what. But there isn't any why or who.
Yeah, yeah. But I think there's a pattern that I've seen, you know, with speakers who often start with something from the library. You know, they'll open up with something that seems very small, very innocuous. You don't quite know where they're going with it, but that's good because it engages us and gets us intrigued.
Yes.
And then there's the reveal of what this little story means to the broader message of what I want to say today. So they might go to the big picture from the library layer. And then they might explain, having hooked the audience and kind of given them a steer on where all this is going.
Yes.
Well, how does this work in practice? And then they'll go to the machinery layer. It's a really nice order to do things in.
Yeah, I agree, and I think you probably got to. I was always taught, and it is what I've learned, and it is how I practice. That you've got to have a winning beginning. You've got to have a magic middle, and you've got to have an enthusiastic end.
Yeah, exactly.
And
but I think that cake approach gives people, you know, the intellectual rigor that they need and the structural understanding, but it also gives them a broader perception of why all this matters and how does it sit in with the bigger picture.
Yes.
But it also gives them specific examples of what it looks like from the library layer.
Yes. Yes.
So I think it's a very successful communication principle I found. That sort of three-layered cake approach.
Yes, no, I like it. Well, Andrew, this has been absolutely brilliant. We've been talking with Andrew Thorp, and you can find Andrew at mojoyourbusiness.com. I think that's right, Andrew, isn't it?
Yeah, mojoyourbusiness.com. That's it.
Yes, and I'll put that link just below this recording. So, Andrew, thank you so much. Folks, this has been another candid and convivial conversation, and my guest today has been Andrew Thorp, one of the great storytellers and teachers of people of how to craft a story, and you can find Andrew at the link below. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.